Hi, welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter. And today is very exciting because I'm joined by not one but two guests, Anne Mara and JP O'Sullivan. Hi guys, how are you?
Good
Hi
morning,
Jane,
Jane.
great to see you.
Yeah, it's great to have you both here, and we'll ask you both a bunch of questions about child trafficking and human trafficking. But to get started, Anne and JP, maybe you can both tell me a little bit about yourselves and your background, please. I will go to Anne first.
Great. Thanks very much, Jane. Well, my background started off, I always wanted to teach, and so I became a qualified secondary school teacher. And all I ever really wanted to do as a teacher was to teach in Africa. And
Oh,
so
wow.
off I went and fell in love with Africa, and that kind of led me on to do a master's in international development. So I would have spent almost a decade living in sub-Saharan Africa and interacting with various different issues of injustice there. And then lived in the States for a while and came back to Ireland. So lived overseas for almost 2 decades, came back to
Okay.
Ireland, and I just came across a job opening at MECPATS, and it fit all of my, I suppose, my passions, my qualifications. And I've been with the project for the last 7 years. And I suppose most recently, then I did another master's in social policy, and because I suppose to give myself a little bit more of a understanding of the Irish context, having lived away for so long. So that's me.
Thanks, Anne. Very fascinating. And JP, over to you. Tell me a little bit about yourself, please.
So my background is one in qualified social work. I graduated from UCC many moons ago. Worked in adult mental health services, then found myself returning to India where I'd done a social work placement and spent many years there working in child protection, safeguarding. And it was there where I was really introduced to the issue of child trafficking.
Okay.
And so I found myself back in Ireland working in marketing for 12 months. And during that 12-month period, it was when the issue of child trafficking came back into my line of vision. And
Okay.
I found myself working with MECPATS on a 3-month contract. And almost 7 years later, I'm still there. Um,
Okay.
so it's been quite the journey,
Yeah.
but an interesting one.
Yeah, so you both have the international dimension from the ground, which is really interesting. And then probably in that direct work that you were doing, could see human rights issues play out before you, and then probably here as well, because of course, human rights abuses and violations don't just take place over there in other countries. They're right under our nose, as we'll discuss. So would one of you like to tell me what actually is MECPATHS and what's its mission and purpose?
Well, MECPATS was set up back in 2013, and it was set up, I suppose, really to raise awareness around the issue of child trafficking. I mean, MECPATS is really the only organization that focuses on child trafficking in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So it was originally established to engage with the hospitality industry, because we know that the hospitality industry is one such industry
Uh-huh.
that traffickers tend to use because it provides a certain amount of privacy and anonymity. And so we started working with individual hotels, training management and staff, and then we moved to kind of interact with the hotel groups or chains. And that was great, but we soon realized there was such an increasing thirst for this type of training across the board. So many other different frontline service providers really coming to terms with the fact that this topic around child trafficking is something that needs to be on the training agenda for
Mm-hmm.
their staff. So it's been really interesting to see how over the last 7 years, I suppose, the understanding of the fact that child trafficking, like you said, Jane, isn't something that's happening in the likes of, sub-Saharan Africa where I was, or
Mm-hmm.
Southeast Asia where JP was, but that it is happening here. And I suppose opening people's eyes to that fact. So MECPATS works with not just frontline professionals and training and educating them, but also with emerging professionals. So we work with the social work programs across the universities in this country. We work with teachers and law students, really, I suppose, introducing the whole topic and language around child trafficking so that when they do embark on their professional careers, it'll be something that's on their agenda.
Thanks very much, Anne. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, JP?
No, I think that's a fairly accurate synopsis of what we're about, Jane.
Thanks very much. And so I've had the pleasure of being at an event that you organised last year before Christmas with Maria Walsh, trying to raise kind of political awareness around various dimensions of child trafficking. And I was talking about the kind of criminal justice, criminal exploitation of children end. And then I also attended a great training that you were running, which was really thought-provoking and beneficial. And I have to confess that, you know, I've a legal background, but this is not something I've thought about long and hard for years. So I did mistakenly think that human trafficking or child trafficking involved moving people across borders. Is that a common error? And you know, what actually then is human trafficking?
It is a common, I suppose, misconception, Jane, that I suppose by the very term trafficking, we think of movement. We think of cars on the road.
Right.
But when we look at the definition and the definitions that have been agreed by the state here in Ireland, we can see very clearly what human trafficking or how it's constructed. So human trafficking involves three distinct components. That's an act, a means, and a purpose.
Okay.
The act is the way in which the person is, I suppose, brought into worlds of trafficking or exploitation. So it involves the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of a person. So when we see, I suppose, the word harboring appear within definitions, that means just the keeping of a person. So it doesn't necessarily involve any movement.
Right.
The means is the way in which they are exploited. So that's through many forms, but the purposes of exploitation, we see them all here, unfortunately, very much alive at home in Ireland. So there's domestic servitude, there's the criminal exploitation, labour exploitation, organ harvesting, forced criminality, forced begging, forced marriage. So that's very much how we construct human trafficking in Ireland through, I suppose, legislative provisions, through definitions that have been embedded in the legislation. But when we look at child trafficking, we see a very, I suppose, different construct. So the means does not need to be present, and because a child can never consent to their own exploitation. So we just need to have an act and a purpose present. We also see, I suppose, further, when we get further into the law, the intention to traffic a person is also provided for within legislation. So the act does not even need to have happened if an adult, I suppose, plans to exploit a child through trafficking. That's also provided for within legislation. So it's very different, I suppose, to maybe what the public perceives trafficking to be. And we think of it as being, as we've mentioned, far away in other countries, crossing borders, but it doesn't need to involve any border crossing. It can happen within towns, within villages, and within cities. And it does happen in those places here in Ireland.
Yeah. Thanks, JP. And so you mentioned that we do have legislative provisions. Do you guys have a preferred definition of child trafficking, let's say from the UN, or you know, is there one that is kind of a beacon that everyone else should ideally follow?
There is the definition that is accepted worldwide, and it's the internationally agreed upon definition, and it's commonly referred to as the Palermo Protocol.
Okay.
And that was agreed back in the year 2000. So we've been using this definition for 23 years. It probably could do with a little bit of updating as human trafficking,
Sure.
facets of it have changed radically over time. However, that is the definition that has been incorporated into both international law, but also domestic law here in Ireland. So I always think it's helpful to kind of break down child trafficking you know, we talk about the act and the purpose, but if we were to give an example of that, the act, if a child is transported to a hotel room in Dublin city centre for the purpose of sexual exploitation, that is clearly a case of child trafficking.
Okay.
And likewise, if a child is recruited for the purpose of forced criminality or criminal exploitation, that too is a clear case of child trafficking.
Okay, that's very interesting on language, because we wouldn't necessarily, I mean, sometimes newspapers would talk about child prostitution, or again, you know, young people involved in gangs maybe making a bit of money off drug dealing. But for you, Anne, and JP, you'd prefer that we spoke the language of child trafficking, would you?
Absolutely, Jane. And I think something that concerns me greatly as well, when we see international reports and domestic reports coming out around the exploitation of adults and young people, is the language that can be used can be quite harmful to the individuals involved in this themselves. We see international reports regularly referring to women and girls in prostitution. A child can never be in prostitution. A child can never ever consent to their own sexual exploitation or any form of exploitation. So we would be, I suppose, very clear, very conscious of the language that is used. We had a very unfortunate media reporting on a case probably in 2021, and it was around the sexual exploitation of a young person who had been transported to a hotel and across a hotel network in Ireland for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And it was two of our national newspapers reported using the very same headline. And it was 15-year-old girl coked off her head in Dublin hotel. That was the language that was used in the headlines by both of the publications. And I suppose when I read it, when I saw it, my thoughts went immediately to that 15-year-old who was living in state care, who was quite probably sitting at home with her phone in her hand, reading about herself, with that language being used to describe the exploitation and abuse that had happened. So it focused primarily on, I suppose, the presenting behaviours of that young person. But it was those presenting behaviours that brought attention from the services that she needed, and were the reason that she ended up in an A&E department, because she'd been so physically harmed by the individuals that had trafficked her. So language is hugely, hugely important. We need to be very, very clear on how we describe what we're seeing in front of us.
That's why we really, I suppose, are passionate about the correct terminology being used, because when we say, for example, children who've been recruited for the purpose of criminal exploitation in this country, when we properly identify them as victims of child trafficking, we're looking and acknowledging the victimhood of those individuals, of those children, children as young as 7, 8, 9, and 10, being groomed into this criminal exploitation. We're looking at them as victims. They have no responsibility, again bringing us back to that, cannot consent to their own exploitation. And so when we often in media reports read them labeled as thugs or deviants, or whatever the term might be, we're doing such a disservice to them, because it's not acknowledging the exploitation that they have encountered and have been brought into from such a young age, and have very, very little opportunity to escape that.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm personally very interested in is the impact of childhood trauma across the life course, and how it has health impacts, behavioural impacts, relational impacts. And even just listening to the examples you both gave there, yeah, sure, the children might not appreciate that they're actually victims. In fact, particularly the boys, or there might be an element of bravado, or even a bit of a drive for agency, that I'm making these choices. Even the girl in the case might have felt, I chose to go there, even if afterwards there was this regret. But the fundamental point is they cannot consent to the activities that they were drug into, and that that language really does matter. Now, in relation to our laws, is that principle fully bedded down in law, that they cannot consent to their own exploitation?
JP is the legal one. He's just, it is embedded. I mean,
Okay.
the whole definition is embedded, and it very clearly adopts the Palermo Protocol
Okay.
as the bedrock for the legislation. And we have a really good synopsis of what Irish law says, and it's very clear. And the fact that Ireland has also adopted the EU directive and has signed up to implement that, and also the bedrock of that EU directive is, of course, the Palermo Protocol. So I think what happened, the confusion is, I don't think there are people still, and I would say it's across the board, general public, in our political realm in this country, across the board, there is a general misunderstanding. And I have to bring up the glaring quotation from our own Taoiseach just a few weeks ago. On a visit to America, and he was asked by a member of the press what Ireland's response was to human trafficking. And his response was appalling, because he said, well, we don't really have a big issue with human trafficking because we're such a small island and we're surrounded by vast seas, and it makes it very difficult for small boats to reach here. Yeah. And I mean, it caused such despair amongst the anti-human trafficking community, because if our own Taoiseach doesn't understand, and yet we have it embedded in legislation, it's very discouraging.
Yes. So again, the kind of conflation between trafficking, boats, and inward migration, or trying to smuggle people in. Yeah, there's a huge need, it seems, all right, for public and policymaker education at that level. So more widely, and we touched on it there in the examples that Anne, you and JP gave, but is there a particular gender dimension to this problem of child trafficking, do you think?
Yeah, there absolutely is. Well, I suppose on a whole, human trafficking is a highly gendered phenomenon, in that it mostly impacts women and girls.
Okay.
So if we look across the globe, 65% of all identified victims are female. In Europe, that jumps up to 75%. So mostly women and girls are impacted by this. But we also know from the global report on trafficking persons that is published by the UNODC that in higher income countries, most children are trafficked for both sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, and forced begging. And you said it yourself, Jane, a little while ago, a lot of the children who are trafficked for criminal exploitation are generally male. And for the majority of children who are trafficked for sexual exploitation are predominantly female.
Okay.
So you have quite a distinction there. But yes, it definitely impacts females more than males.
Okay. And just thinking back to The Wire, you know, watching that back in the day, there was season 2 was all actually about smuggling, you know, and human trafficking for sexual exploitation purposes, but they were adult women being brought into the States for prostitution. And in that case, I suppose as adults, they might have been thinking they were going to get a better life. But the risks that people take in that context as well, in moving across borders unsafely, are immense. But to reiterate the point we've made multiple times, if they're children, they cannot consent to any of these activities, and should not be held responsible for any crimes that they might commit at the demands of others. And we'll talk a bit more about that now in a second. But one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you both is because I'm involved in the Research, Evidence and Policy Programs and Practice group at UL, and it's a youth justice program. I'm research fellow on the Greentown project. So we've 2 trial sites, and we are seeking to help children who are involved in criminal networks to escape them safely, ideally, and find avenues for personal development. And it's not easy. So again, to return to the language of child trafficking, would you both describe the children and young people who are involved? They might think they're doing so willingly. They might willingly be selling drugs in their own minds, or, you know, intimidating local people, you know, demanding money with menaces in certain cases. So can they really be viewed as offenders, or should they be viewed as offenders under the law?
My response to that, Jane, is absolutely not. They shouldn't be seen as offenders. I mean, absolutely shouldn't be criminalized. I mean, I suppose the innate nature of being a child is that vulnerability, and that's what's being identified and being exploited by the adults or even older children in these environments. We've been working for the past 18 months really with groups, organizations, agencies. Yes, there are Dublin-based organizations and agencies, but there are agencies all over the country, all over the Republic of Ireland, who are seeing the very same thing. That is, I suppose, being identified in our capital city, in our large cities, in towns, in villages, very rural communities. It's this exploitation of the vulnerability. So if a child's vulnerability is being exploited, how should they be, or why should they be criminalized for that? You know, we as a state have a huge responsibility to protect the children in our care. That's not just, I suppose, traditional child protection services that we need to provide, but we need to look at all of the vulnerabilities of children, all of the types of exploitation that are happening. We have our criminal exploitation, we have our sexual exploitation. We see it on the streets of towns and villages, children who are put to work begging on the streets. You know, we can at times overlook this or turn a blind eye. Somebody said to us a few years ago, you know, the lid really needs to be lifted on this can of worms, because worms were never meant to live in a can. Yeah. But we have, I suppose, global responsibility that when you do identify a challenge or a harm or a concern, that you have that moral obligation to respond to it. And that's where the state really, in my opinion, falls down. They don't want to lift the lid off the can, because if you see the problem, you have to respond to it. To respond to it, you have to offer resources. So there's huge challenges. I think we're very quick, Jane, to label young people as those offenders, or even at times those victims of exploitation. But we need to see the vulnerabilities that are within those communities and respond to them as vulnerabilities and exploitation.
Yeah, I think, you know, Jane, just to follow on from what JP said, the current response in place at the moment for these children would be youth diversion programs. Okay. But I think by very nature of their name, it's about diverting children away from their lives as criminals or offenders, you know, so it's already slapped them with that label of offender. And I think that can be very damaging. It is very damaging.
Yeah, and one area that I completely 100% agree with you is that even aside from child trafficking per se, most children and frankly most adults who become involved in crime are also victims as well as, you know, perpetrators. That part of their story is often neglected, you know, particularly in the criminal courts. But the principle of non-punishment, is that from the Palermo Protocol?
That would be most clearly defined within the EU directive.
Okay.
that Ireland signed up to in 2011, and it's being reviewed right now. But the principle of non-punishment is very, very strong in that for both adults and children who have been trafficked, that they would not be penalised for committing an offence or an illegal activity within their experience of that exploitation. So it's very, very clearly outlined, and it's something that Ireland has agreed to take on board and to pursue. I think that is probably a little bit down the line in terms of the conversations we're having in this country, because you have to acknowledge the whole issue of trafficking before you can really look into the non-punishment principle. I suppose just to comment on child trafficking in this country, when we say that there's very little awareness, our official statistics, when they're released every year by the Department of Justice, quite concerningly, over the last 3 years, there have only been 4 children identified as victims of trafficking. And when we compare that to the numbers of our nearest neighbours, Northern Ireland and across the UK in general, they are identifying thousands of children who are victims of child trafficking. And our own Irish national children are showing up in the statistics within the UK. So last year, there were approximately 9 Irish children that were identified by the National Referral Mechanism in the UK. That's hugely, hugely alarming. So we're not spotting them here. And our figures would say, well, we really don't have a big issue with child trafficking because we don't have many victims, but we're simply not looking for them. We're simply not identifying the long-term impact of that trauma and of that exploitation of children. I mean,
it's very startling, all right. And the, it's kind of not name it to tame it, but if you don't understand you have a problem in the first place, one, you don't understand what it is and you can't see it. You think it's out there, it's other people are not doing their job, but we somehow are. Irish exceptionalism, it seems like a good example of that. But just to return to the Greentown context again, and as you said, JP, there are communities up and down the country for various reasons, normally with generations of deprivation, intergenerational trauma, unemployment, poor housing, too many encounters maybe with child protection, poor sense of trust towards state services and the guards in general. And then you have children with inadequate parental supervision who get sucked into these criminal networks. Some of them now might do some pretty hair-raising things, some quite violent things, but the principle of non-punishment, I presume, is no matter what you do under coercion, you should not be held criminally responsible for that. Is that correct? So it's not like you can commit minor offences at the behest of the network, but then if you do some violent acts, then all of a sudden you're not a victim of child trafficking anymore. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I think, Jane, you've touched on something there that's very important, that we need to look at as well, is just around that familial piece. Just children who are, I suppose, born into networks of exploitation, who are being brought into worlds of trafficking by parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Like, that's a hugely, I suppose, important piece that we need to look at, because when we look at victimhood and we look at trauma, and if we talk about young people being those, I suppose, offenders, the thugs, the criminals, and you bring it back to that young person themselves, and you think of them sitting alone in their bedroom at the end of the day, and they're thinking back or reflecting on what they've done for the day. They've made maybe 100 quid. They've sold drugs in their town or their village, but nobody's talking about them as a child. Nobody's talking about their experience of being brought into that by a parent or grandparent. We're overlooking the self-identification piece. And in doing that, we're overlooking the services that need to be provided for them. We can talk about those, the youth diversion programs, but we're talking within that about criminality, and we're talking about moving somebody away from it, hoping that they'll exit criminality. But we're not talking about the innate vulnerability of a child being the victim at the hands of an adult unknown or known to them. And then we look at legislation being introduced, pieces like Fagan's Law into the country, that rely on a child having to give evidence for the state to secure a prosecution.
Yeah,
How
it's a
can
big
we
ask.
rely on a child, 8, 9, 10 years of age, for us as adults to secure a prosecution? It's just, the mind boggles.
It does boggle a bit, all right. And I'm delighted as well that you brought that up, JP, because there are family networks, and surely it must be, if it's difficult to exit or be identified as a victim of child trafficking in an organized kind of crime gang type situation, in an urban part of Dublin or Cork or Limerick. If you're actually a child growing up in a household where crime is the norm, you might actually love your parents, they might love you, there might be a good bond there, but there's no choice. It's just expected of you. Like, how do you tackle that at all? Like, what even are the answers? Is removal from the family of origin? Is that the way to go? Hugely complex, I think, in terms of thinking about what is the best interest of the child at all there, and also, if you do take a child into care, will even their history and their constrained choices be properly understood, or will they still be kind of blamed and shamed for something that really they had no choice in from the point of conception almost?
Which is why, Jane, I think we're so passionate about the correct use of terminology, and the fact that we would call it as it is, that these children are victims of child trafficking. And I think when we start, I suppose, looking through that lens, then we are correctly identifying them as victims of a crime. We're correctly looking specifically at their vulnerability, at the exploitation, and really putting the child at the center of our efforts. I think that's the first step.
Okay.
It's hugely complex, and like you said, like from your own research going back, like something like it's over 90% of these children who were identified as being groomed for criminal exploitation have familial connections. So it's hugely complex, but I think the very starting step we need to embark on is adopting the correct terminology and language, and looking through that lens at the child at the center. What is in the best interest of that child?
The state has a role to play in this, clearly, as do people working in the front lines. You mentioned teachers, you mentioned hoteliers, I presume the guards and various others, anyone really coming into contact with children who might have a suspicion. But how can the state and individuals who are, in regular contact with children better respond to child trafficking, do you think?
I suppose to echo what Anne has already said, it's about shifting that lens. It's about, I suppose, educating ourselves as frontline professionals. It's about accessing probably education and training pieces from our European neighbours who are ahead of the game in relation to child trafficking. It's about seeing, again, and I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's again about seeing the vulnerability of the child. It's about, I suppose, accessing that education piece, having conversations, lobbying government for change, lobbying government to recognise child trafficking as the widespread issue that it is in Ireland. It's about having, I suppose, multidisciplinary opportunities to explore the issue of trafficking. It's great that suppose we can educate social workers, and at times we can educate teachers, and we can do a little bit of GP training and medical setting training, but it's about joining the conversations.
Yeah.
It's about building the responses and the reporting protocols. We have state offered reporting protocols for the public in terms of what to do if you have concerns around human trafficking. They're very general and very generic. It's ring 999 and hope the person on the end of the phone knows what you're talking about. So it's about having joined up conversations, joined up agreement that child trafficking is an issue that needs the attention that it does need. And it's about moving forward. We were hopeful for quite a while that with a change in legislation, we would have a child-centric national referral mechanism. Coming down the tracks are in place. Agencies alongside us that have appealed for that include the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, the Children's Rights Alliance. We've heard the Ombudsman speaking about it. But it doesn't look like that's going to land for Ireland. And the response to, I suppose, the requests were, well, other European countries don't have it, so we won't have it. That's not good enough. That's just not good enough. If we're trying to shoehorn children into adult services, their needs are not going to be met. So what does the state need to do? Recognise that child trafficking is an issue and respond accordingly so that the children who are being exploited in Ireland have the full suite of human rights delivered to them that they're entitled to.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, JP. And maybe you can just explain a little bit more, what is this referral mechanism that you mentioned?
So the National Referral Mechanism is the instrument or the tool in Ireland that brings people into areas of support and safety. Mm-hmm. So it involves the formal identification of a victim. At the moment, it's only the guards have that responsibility. As legislative changes come into place, we'll have agencies like TUSLA, the HSE, the Workplace Relations Commission, Department of Children, and also the Department of Justice having that responsibility. So once you're formally identified by any of those actors, you're provided with accommodation, healthcare, legal supports. If you're a child, you're afforded the right to access to education. But I suppose within that, the challenges that are, I suppose, have been embedded for so many years include the accommodation piece, Jane. At the moment, if you're non-Irish national, the accommodation that's provided to you is direct provision, which we all know on its best day of the week is not fit for purpose. No. And we would hear anecdotally that adults who are placed in direct provision as victims of trafficking quite often encounter their traffickers there again and are re-trafficked out of direct provision. Yes. So that, in a nutshell, is what the NRM is supposed to be, the protective arm of the state to respond to the needs of victims of trafficking.
Just on that last point about direct provision as well, I remember years ago, I think it was a report by maybe Anti-Deportation Ireland, we're talking about direct provision centres in Cork being used by men in search of prostitution. Again, so looking at, you might have a young vulnerable girl or boy who is a victim of child trafficking, who then gets placed in a house for several years, where, as you say, there are further trafficking and exploitation opportunities rife there. I was just wondering also, you mentioned some examples of good practice. Are there particular countries in Europe that might serve as a model, or elsewhere where we could look to, these guys are doing it really well, perhaps you should adopt this type of thing?
In terms of identification, and I'll just go heavy on the term identification there, I think the UK do quite a good job in terms of identifying the children. Okay. I wouldn't say the pieces necessarily after that are top of the class, right. But they are very good in identifying the exploitation of children. Mm-hmm. Their NRM needs a bit of work.
If you look at their official statistics, almost 50% of the identified victims of trafficking in the UK are children. So they really are doing a great job. Sorry.
That level, yeah. And just one other point on the direct provision, or this is somewhat wider. Do you guys have a view on, let's say, the children again who have been trafficked are foreign national children originally, so then they're put in direct provision, but
No, that's very clear to make the distinction. It's only adult victims that are placed in direct provision.
Okay.
All children, child victims of trafficking fall under the responsibility of TUSLA, the
Okay.
Child and Family Agency. So TUSLA have always had the responsibility for accommodating child victims of trafficking. However, alarmingly so, I suppose, you know, their first engagement with the whole conversation around child trafficking has only formally begun most recently. And I suppose since the war in Ukraine and the unprecedented numbers of vulnerable children and women coming to Ireland seeking protection, that really the conversation has only really opened up in any meaningful way, I would say, to the point that TUSLA don't currently have a mechanism by which to capture any data around child victims of trafficking. There's no information on what type of exploitation they've been trafficked for, breakdown in terms of gender, etc. So there's no so children have always been the responsibility and will remain so.
Okay. That's heartening, but might they be returned? Because I suppose if adults go into direct provision, they need to then have a determination as to whether they can remain or not. And sometimes even if they have been grotesquely abused and exploited by Irish men or whatever, they could still be deported or returned to their country of origin. Would children who are trafficked enjoy better protection in that regard? And be allowed to remain here if they wanted to?
Yeah, I suppose a concern I would have both for the adults and the children, Jane, in this regard, really is when people are entered into the NRM, you have a reflection period. So you have an allotted amount of time that you can decide whether or not you want to engage with the criminal investigation.
Okay.
If you choose not to engage with that, then you lose your right to access the services. So your accessibility to services is dependent on your willingness to engage in the investigation.
Shocking.
Which, for me, I suppose, you know, as a social worker, that's not correct in my eyes. You know, we need to be looking at victim supports rather than racing to support the state in arriving at a prosecution piece. It's not a victim-centric model that we have at present, and that really, really needs to change and to shift. It's not built for the victim; it's built for the state.
And just to that point, like, you know, when you asked, would non-Irish national children be returned? We have to it opens up the bigger conversation, like, who are the child victims of trafficking in this country? And I think there is that misconception that trafficking only impacts non-Irish national children. So we have to look at Irish national, EU national children living in this country as potential victims of trafficking. So I think a lot of times it's the unaccompanied minors seeking international protection that may be, you know, have either been trafficked at their country of in their country of origin, en route to Ireland, or at destination. But when they enter into that international protection system, then they are here, and they have their right to stay here. But it does open up that question, like, well, who are the child victims of trafficking in this country? And I think the tendency has always been to limit it to the conversation around non-Irish national children.
Yeah, and that is a great point. Again, it brings us right back to the beginning when I was saying, you know, about my confusion initially around movement across borders. In fact, if we counted, if we opened our eyes and looked closer, we'd probably find that non-Irish kids are in the minority in terms of child trafficking in this country, that there's much more in the criminal networks dotted around the place and in child sexual exploitation networks, you know, whether through the care system or beyond. But we need to be, I guess, the message is to just be a lot more vigilant in general, and not be so content to think, oh, it's just not happening here. It's someone else's problem over there. Just one final question, folks, and thanks so much for being so generous with your time and insights into this fascinating and depressing subject matter. In terms of politicians and policymakers, then, what one or two things do you think they should prioritize to combat child trafficking in the short term, given that it's a long-term project, I think?
Yeah, I think, I think crucially, and I suppose because it is the foundation upon which our project was established in the first place, just that training, that awareness raising, introducing people to the language around child trafficking, being able to introduce individuals, frontline professionals, emerging professionals, to the indicators of the different types of trafficking, what to do, how to report it. I think that awareness raising and opening up that conversation across the board, general public included, is vitally important. And so if that was on some kind of a legislative or policy basis, making this training, awareness raising, a mandatory part of staff training or continuing professional development, I think that would be hugely significant.
Thanks, Anne. What about you, JP? Would you agree with that, or would you have anything to add?
I would, and I think there's opportunities there as well for our public servants to maybe educate themselves a little bit about the issue of trafficking, how it differs from smuggling, and maybe meeting with the communities that we're meeting with who are impacted by the issue of child trafficking in their own backyards. So if I suppose politicians are on the chase for votes, maybe spend a little bit more time with your constituents who are being impacted by this and understand what they're talking about when they say they are victims of child trafficking or adult trafficking.
Okay. Thank you so much, folks. This has been Law and Justice with me, Jane Mulcahy, and I was joined by Anne Mara and JP O'Sullivan from MECPAT. Thanks so much for being with me. It's been great.
Thanks, Jane.
Thanks a lot.